Today we're going to be looking at a scenario where Russia invades Ukraine. Now with current world events, this doesn't seem too impossible because Russia's been kind of gearing up their military near the border of Ukraine, so we might see a part 2 to 2014. This video isn't going to be 100% realistic, so just keep that in mind. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like on it and subscribe to the channel if you're new, and let's go ahead and get started. So like I said, Russia is going to be invading Ukraine here. Now, Ukraine isn't in NATO. They've been trying to do something with NATO, but it just hasn't been working because Russia's kind of been blocking them from it. But for the sake of the video and making it more interesting, let's go ahead and say that Ukraine did manage to get into NATO, and is the reason why Russia is invading them. Obviously, with Russia invading a NATO member, all the other NATO members are going to be involved. So now all of NATO is involved in the war with Russia, and this is now a global event. It's only global because of the Americas, but still, it's considered global. To kind of save themselves, Russia goes ahead and recruits Belarus into the war. Now, Belarus is a IRL Russian ally. They would probably join any war that Russia was in. And in order to kind of put pressure on NATO and kind of make it seem like they're at war with more nations, Russia also recruits the Central Asian countries into the war. Following this, we have Georgia joining the war because Russia's already kind of invading them. And we also have Azerbaijan joining the war because of Turkey. And ultimately, Armenia's in the middle, so they're just going to get invaded. There are some other countries, such as Finland and Bosnia, that would probably join this war because of NATO relations. But for the sake of Russia, we're not going to be having them join. So now we have the actual invasion of Ukraine, and Russia pushes in from the east and the north. They also make a move up from Crimea and start to take the coast of the Black Sea. Eventually their fronts are connected, and a great push into Ukraine is started. Ukraine doesn't take this too lightly though, as they manage to push Russia out of their borders in the north, and even start to counteract some of the Russian invasions in the east. Eventually though, after full preparation, Russia pushes back and starts to near Kiev. There's at this point where we go into greater detail and see how Russia takes Kiev. So at first we have Russian forces slowly pushing in towards the city, but they meet the big Ukrainian defense defending the city. Now if Ukraine loses Kiev, that's not going to be good for the country. If they lose their capital, then their troops are probably going to lose motivation and fall back to NATO. So the troops fight fiercely, and Russia makes no progress getting towards the city. Eventually though, Russia does create a flank and starts to go around the city, cutting off some supply lines. Ukraine did anticipate that this would happen and starts to push back the flank. Eventually though, Russia makes another flank and manages to connect their fronts. We also have Ukraine pushing back the Russian army in the east just a little bit, but ultimately this has no avail as the Russians start to push in on all sides. Down south though, we do have Ukraine making little progress in the Black Sea, as one of their more skilled armies are down here fighting back against Russia. It isn't looking too good up north though, as the Russians do completely surround the land around the city, and eventually Kiev falls. And with that, we have the start of the fall of Ukraine as Russian troops start to swarm in. We even have Belarus making a slight push in and invading parts of Ukraine. After lots of fighting, Ukraine is left with these current borders, which only consist of its western part and a little bit of its southern part. In addition to the invasion of Ukraine, Russia does make a push from Kaliningrad and connects with Belarus in order to cut off NATO from the Baltics. During this time, we also had Russia preparing another military, and from here we have them invading the Baltics with great success. Eventually the Baltics fall, and Russia now has one big front against NATO. Down in the Caucasus, we had the blue team wiping out Armenia and making a small push in southern Russia. Around this time, we also have the major blue team powers getting all their troops ready, and they are starting to be stationed near the front lines in order to counteract Russia's invasion. Before that happens though, Russia does make a little bit more progress in Ukraine and even starts to push into northern Romania. Russia manages to get this far until they start to meet the major power militaries. The first thing to happen is Russia getting pushed out of Poland and Ukraine being occupied. We have the blue team completely capturing Kaliningrad and pushing up into the Baltic nations. This doesn't stop Russia in the south though, as they push into Hungary and Slovakia, as well as the rest of northern Romania. Eventually they made up with Serbia and cut off NATO into two pieces once again. Over in the Caucasus nations, we have even more success for the blue team, as Turkey is mostly helping out this front over here. This is mostly just, like I said, a Turkey and Caucasian front. There isn't much support from the rest of the blue team. But Russia's main priority right now is the rest of Europe. Eventually, NATO starts to liberate all the Baltic nations, and it pushes Russia back to their border. Russia does have success in invading all of Romania though, and they start a push into Bulgaria. Back over in Slovakia and Hungary, the main Russian army manages to cut off NATO even more, as Slovenia and Croatia and the rest of Hungary are completely isolated from the other half of NATO. This doesn't last long though, as NATO starts to recuperate and pushes Russia back to the Ukrainian and Romanian borders. Up north, we also have NATO pushing into Belarus and nearing Minsk. Over in the Balkans, Turkey starts to kind of divert their attention away from the southern front and focuses on Romania and Bulgaria and their liberations. We have Turkey pushing up to Bulgaria and southern Romania, and the rest of NATO pushing into western Romania and western Ukraine. From here, the two fronts meet and start the liberation of Romania. Without the support of Turkey, though, the front over in the Caucasus starts to fall as Russia pushes the line of conflict back to Georgia and Azerbaijan. They only hold defense here as they aren't really interested in expanding down this way, as their main problem right now is that NATO is starting to invade into their territory. Eventually, we have a swift liberation of Ukraine, as a lot of the people there do not consent to being under Russian rule, obviously, and Belarus is easily folded. Eventually, Kiev is liberated, and Russia starts to fall back to its borders. So now we have Russia with very little land gains. We even have NATO and Belarus starting to push into Russian territory. Crimea is then occupied by NATO, and Turkey returns to its front in the Caucasus, and even meets up with NATO over here near Crimea. From here, we have a full-scale NATO invasion of Russia. Obviously, this isn't going to be too realistic, as Russia would put up more of a fight, but let's go ahead and say that NATO has lots of success and manages to push Russia all the way back to near Moscow. At this point, Russia doesn't see a point in fighting anymore and decides to surrender over to NATO. With that, all of Central Asia follows, and NATO has won the war. So taking a look at a peace treaty here, we have not much changes on the map, but we do have some new government installations. So that is the main, conclusion of this war. So land-based wise, we have Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania getting a little bit of land from both Belarus and Russia. We have Poland annexing all of Kaliningrad. Ukraine gets Crimea back and a little bit of land over here in Russia. A new government is set up in Belarus, and a new government is set up in Russia. As for the Caucasus Mountain nations, we have Turkey, Georgia, and Azerbaijan splitting up Armenia. Now, if Russia were to win this scenario, I'm not going to draw it out, but they would just annex Ukraine and possibly get a little bit of Georgia and maybe some of the Baltics. But other than that, that's all Russia would get. It's not much of a difference. So there's really no point in drawing it. That's going to do it for this video, and if you enjoyed it, please make sure to leave a like on it and subscribe to the channel if you're new. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.